So it seems that we've got some rules teasers for the Neurotyrant today. It looks like Leviathan's new Alpha Brain Bug is truly terrifying to the enemy army, to the extent where every single model on the board can feel his presence. Let's talk about how this guy's looking in 10th. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about the Neurotyrant, particularly focusing on the two rules that Games Workshop have previewed for this guy. Just a couple of little teasers, but rather interesting ones at that. It is kind of surprising when a single model can have board-wide impact, even if it is just for a turn. As I'm sure most people who are watching will be aware, this guy is basically one of the big bads from the new Tyranid Leviathan box, essentially billed as basically a Psyker Hive Tyrant, a bigger badder version of a Zoanthrope, and a synaptic linchpin for the Tyranids to disseminate the hive mind's will. While the regular hive tyrants might fight by more direct methods, big thick armor plating, biocannons, and fearsome melee weapons, this guy has it all in its head, using his unnatural powers of the warp to blast his enemies to death, shield himself from harm, and float eerily across the battlefield. As models go, it's been enormously well received, a really creepy eldritch horror from the Tyranids, harking back to the 2nd edition Zoanthrope models. And in a recent video that I did talking about the Leviathan models, this guy was voted the single best miniature in the box, and not by a small margin either. Good to know that it looks like he'll be able to do something useful on the table. It would be a shame if he wasn't at least usable. Getting on to Games Workshop's preview, they basically told us 2 different rules for this thing, plus a clarification on the Neuroloids. Certainly in some ways very interesting, as it basically tells us about his special rules, but I must admit in some ways kind of annoying. While these are nice and fun to see, I think it would have been very nice if they'd just shown off his datasheet, or at least a little bit of his damage and defense. I'd particularly like to know his stat lines and whether he can join units or be shielded by things, and in particular just how much damage he's going to be able to do with his inevitable psychic shooting attack. It makes this a bit more of a rules teaser than us overall knowing what the Neurotyrant does, but I guess still gives us some details. I'd say his biggest rule is perhaps his amplification of the shadow in the warp, and making units board-wide have the chance to be battle-shocked on really quite an easy number. Some synaptic command benefits, though unfortunately it looks like those cute little Neuroloids are basically little more than tokens for his synaptic command abilities, and they aren't really going to have models with their own rules tanking shots for him. Let's take a look at what we've got though. First up, if you've been following Games Workshop's Tyranid previews, you'll know already that one of their faction abilities is called Shadow in the Warp. In previous versions of 40k, it's tended to be a debuff within close range to synapse units, often making enemies cast Psychic on a worse value or worsening their leadership, but the 10th edition version of it appears to be a devastating wave of dread that sweeps through the entire enemy army, giving them the chance to eat those rather brutal Battleshock debuffs. For the fine print on how it works, you basically get to trigger it in either player's command phase. I think usually you probably want to use it in the other player's command phase, as then the debuffs will be most effective. What happens is that literally every enemy unit on the board has to take a Battleshock test, roll their 2d6 versus leadership, and if they roll under then they're battle-shocked, presumably regrouping at the start of their next command phase. While leadership in 9th edition often didn't make such a big deal, Battleshock in 10th does look like it's going to be really quite an important area of the game, and it seems that they're going to be designing it that no army is immune. Having to test Battleshock board-wide could be absolutely brutal for cheap objective holders, things like Chaos Cultists or other low leadership, low value things sat on objectives, and if they happen to fail it, you could basically rob the opponent of an objective for a turn, as if you trigger it in their command phase, they're not going to have any opportunity to reposition it to take those points with something that can hold it. It also means that the units can't use any stratagems, which could be pretty brutal for any enemy damage dealers that might want to make use of a good one, and it can also give them problems with falling back. If they need to drop away from your units, then you have a pretty high chance to lose models. I'd guess that maybe the enemy's second command phase might be a really good time to use it, that way the enemy army is actually engaged and isn't just hiding in their deployment zone. But you also want to be using this early in the game so that it actually has a big impact early on to swing the game in your favour. It is a bit scattergun, and you can't decide exactly which units are going to fail, but I still think it's got the potential to be hugely disruptive, and even more so if you've got a Neurotyrant on the table. Feeding into that, and it seems that the Neurotyrant's rule is Psychic Terror, the rule reading that if one or more Neurotyrants are on the board, then when the enemies take their Shadow in the Warp test, they must take a -1 to that Battleshock test, so it makes every enemy unit significantly more likely to fail than otherwise. From the way it's worded, it doesn't stack if you have multiple different Neurotyrants on the table, so I feel like it's going to incentivize just running the one of them in your army. Almost certainly won't be worth spamming them unless their damage and defense is insanely good, but still any rule that has an effect over the entire battlefield, even just for a turn, is pretty big. As we've had the previews, it seems like the common leaderships in 10th edition are leadership 6 or 7. Leadership 6 is the Space Marine one, and also for other higher discipline armies, Leadership 7 seems to be the most common that we've seen so far, applying to armies like the Sisters of Battle, Necrons, or Leagues of Votan. The fact that these are kind of middling values on the d6 chart means that you really do increase the chances of them failing by a massive amount just by a -1 modifier. Space Marines on a leadership of 6+ would go from a 28% chance to fail Battleshock to a big 42%. That means even against the supposedly good leadership Adeptus Astartes, you're on average going to have 40% of their army Battleshocks on the turn that you trigger the Shadow. For armies with the worst leadership though, obviously it's a much bigger deal. For the armies with leadership 7+, normally they'd already have a 40% chance of failing, but when it goes down to a leadership 8+ effectively, it means they're actually going to be failing the Shadow tests 58% of the time, almost 60% of the army Battleshocked on the turn that you trigger it. I'd say both of these are pretty meaningful increases, and having the Neurotyrant on the board generally means that you've got 2 or 3 more squads failing Battleshock that they wouldn't have otherwise. I guess it means that the Neurotyrant would have even bigger effect on really big games if the enemy army is bigger, and it means that his board-wide rule would affect even more stuff. Overall, I think that this is a really solid rule. Handing out those debuffs can be pretty nasty, particularly to linchpin enemy units if you get lucky. I think provided the Neurotyrant's damage and defense are costed at least somewhat fairly, he could be a very valuable model to buy in the army. This rule alone I think is worth a fair few points already, never mind what else he does. Otherwise, the second preview that we have is his enhanced synapse, this one apparently the Neurotyrant Synaptic Relay. For Tyranid defense against Battleshock, synapse is going to be very important to that. Most of their non-synapse units are leadership 8+, so pretty dreadful there. And it's perhaps going to be even more important than currently to keep the non-synapse units covered by the brain bugs, as that allows you to test Battleshock on a 3d6. It's a very meaningful increase to leadership, usually dropping the chance of failing Battleshock from 58% all the way down to 17%, so way better leadership than Space Marines these days. The small 6-inch range might be an issue though, particularly if you do start losing synapse units, and it seems that the Neurotyrant can help with that a bit, having a bit more long range and flexibility. For the Synapse command ability, it seems that the Neurotyrant gets a Synaptic Relay, and it basically gives you a lot more control over which units get Synapse, including ones that are on the move. The idea is that in your command phase you get to select up to 2 friendly Tyranid units within 12 inches of the model, and then until the start of your next command phase, even if those models choose to move a long way outside of range, they'll still count as being in Synapse up to that point. As Games Workshop said in their article, theoretically that could be quite good if you had units that were trying to charge down the enemy. In particular, they tend to be kind of hard to coordinate with auras and things, as they're often going to need to stretch themselves as far into the enemy lines as possible, and maybe leave behind their big alpha beasts. I'd say maybe the one big issue with this rule is that it looks like it ends at the start of your next command phase, as opposed to just sometime within it. I guess that means that in the enemy turn, if they cause casualties on your unit and you need to take a Battleshock test, that will probably be done at some point in your command phase, so they would lose this ability before they need to test. Despite this though, I think it still definitely has its uses. Plenty of things in 40k seem to hand out Battleshock besides just casualties, so this will help defend against that, and it still means that units that are within the 12-inch range of the Neurotyrant, you'd probably be able to apply this ability to them before they have to take Battleshock tests, so it means that they could still be in Synapse even if they were outside 6 inches. Certainly looks like he's going to be a useful guy to have somewhere in the middle of your lines, pushing out the synapse range to a bit and being able to apply it just a little bit more flexibly, but I'd still say that out of the two rules, the big -1 leadership debuff to Shadow in the Warp seems better. The article did say though that those 2 Neuroloids that he came with, apparently they're going to be just used as tokens, presumably to be put by the buffed units for this ability, so I guess they'd function as a little marker just to show that they've got synapse for the turn. I can't help but be just a little bit disappointed if that's all they are. There's quite a lot of models in 40k that get a couple of attendants that can help tank shots for them, things like tower drones and things. I thought they'd probably function similar to that, maybe with some sort of option to expend them to do something really nasty with psychic damage. Still though, as tokens go, I think they're about the coolest ones that you can get. Cute little baby brain Tyranids. Let me know what you make of the Neurotyrant preview though. How impactful do you think that the Shadow in the Warp and the debuff are going to be? It certainly seems that if you do have a Neurotyrant in tow, it's going to lay Battleshock on a decent chunk of the enemy army. I feel like that's going to be a big psychological blow for a turn. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep up with Games Workshop's news and previews, and I'll aim to cover any more Tyranids rules that we get as they come out. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, The link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.